Hi, everyone. This week we're joined by Madison Hilly, founder and director of the Campaign for a Green Nuclear Deal, to explore the discourse around nuclear energy and identify the cultural reasons why people oppose nuclear energy. As we're about to explore, NIMBYs, particularly in the West, often oppose nuclear energy purely for anti-development reasons. The way that nuclear energy is depicted in popular culture, from The Simpsons to the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, makes people skeptical about the safety of nuclear power plants. Safety is then weaponized to oppose nuclear projects, but as Madi is about to explain, nuclear energy is a safe technology, and people's fears are often unwarranted. Nuclear powers, in many ways, are best shot at mitigating the climate crisis.
So, yeah, I guess we'll start off. I'm just going to hit you with some questions and stuff that we've come up with, and you can give us about your background and how you got into this. So first, when did you exactly become pro-nuclear energy? Do you have an arc of being against it and then coming around to it, or?
No, unlike a lot of nuclear activists who actually started out as anti-nuclear, I just didn't really have exposure to nuclear power. I mean, my dad got a physics degree from the University of Chicago. So I remember going there to Stagfield when I was little, and he would talk about the first sustained chain reaction being under our feet. So that was my only real exposure to nuclear until 2016. And it was the last year of my studies at the University of Wisconsin. I was studying environmental science and political science. And I was feeling torn about what I wanted to do next. I knew I wanted to do some sort of advocacy and policy, but felt really torn between two paths that I viewed as very different. One being climate change and climate mitigation, and the other being poverty alleviation. Yeah. And the reason I thought they were so different is a lot of the talk about climate change and what we could do to address it seemed to me to be resigning a lot of people to poverty. You know, much of the global South and other parts of the world don't enjoy modernity that we do. And the conversation was always, how can we use less? How can we do less?
Austerity.
Right. And I thought, well, we're not talking about the large parts of the world that don't have their basic needs met. So the idea that, yes, climate change is going to disproportionately affect the least well-off, I could buy that. But I thought there are already so many people living in complete poverty. You know, what about addressing that first? Yeah. And just through a series of really fortunate coincidences and connections, I ended up being in touch with this lawyer in Madison who was on the board of a new nonprofit, a pro-nuclear environmental nonprofit in Berkeley. And the only experience with nuclear that I had in my studies was watching a single documentary on Fukushima in an energy class. And that's that's why we don't talk about nuclear, because Fukushima. And so I really went in with an open mind. And when I heard the environmental case for nuclear, it felt like it just clicked. You know, it's not that we need to sacrifice the natural environment to have people lifted out of poverty. It's actually through lifting people out of poverty and through progress that we can set aside more nature for nature. And that vision is only made possible through the clean, abundant, reliable, cheap power of nuclear energy.
Yeah, because the land use for nuclear, the amount of land you need is lower than other forms, particularly solar, right?
Oh, absolutely. It really comes back to energy density. You need a Coke can's worth of uranium to power a modern lifestyle for my entire life.
Wow.
And that's even before recycling that. And so you're talking about a small waste stream, a small number of plants compared to, the fossil fuel infrastructure you would need, small land footprint, and that less mining, et cetera.
Yeah. And on that kind of asking people to give up things. It kind of reminds me of in the 70s during the oil crisis. That's what a lot of the language was of all right, if we're facing energy scarcity, then everyone lower your thermostats and wear a sweater. That's what Jimmy Carter was saying to people. And that was famous. It's held up as this terrible example of that's not going to induce positive feelings or change in anyone. Asking people to compromise their lifestyles.
Right, exactly. That's not a winning political message. And fortunately, it's also not true that you need that to be to deal with energy scarcity or with environmental protection, that it's actually building reliable systems based on, this amazing fuel that we can do with less.
I will say, like, sometimes people do need to give up things. Like, coming from Las Vegas, like, over the course of my time there, like, with water scarcity, it was like, all right, you now have to water your lawns at night so it doesn't, evaporate faster, and you can only water on these days, and you need to, like, zero escape. So I think that is like a case of like, all right, maybe we did overdraw from our resources, and so now we need to take it back. But with power, like, if there's a source out there that is actually abundant, then
right. And I'm not like a huge fan of like big lawns in suburbia, but also through nuclear power, you can get really cheap. The idea is you would get really cheap desalination. Oh. And so suddenly even water scarcity, particularly in the West, is not the problem that it once was.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
So, how did you start your work on the campaign for a green nuclear deal, and what kind of work does your organization do?
So, Campaign for a Green Nuclear Deal really started during lockdown of 2020. I just remember scrolling on Twitter and one day kind of getting a little baffled, but also infuriated. Like, we are the wealthiest country in the history of the world, and for some reason, we can't manufacture our own masks and PPE. Like, what is going on here? And I sort of realized, I was so used to talking about the lack of capability and the state of the nuclear industry being in decline. And that lack of capability and that lack of experience and that lack of industrial power went way beyond the nuclear sector. Actually, it's, this broader issue with the American economy. And I realized, the financialized wealth that we have doesn't buy us the ability to do big society scale collective projects together. It doesn't allow for us to invest in infrastructure, doesn't allow for long-term planning. So I thought, okay, at a time when coronavirus is really revealing all of these things to the American people, it never felt more possible to articulate a new vision of reindustrialization. And what better technology to start with than nuclear, because
it's the most urgent. It's
hard, it's urgent, and it can produce the energy that can then power the rest of those industrialization efforts. And so the Campaign for a Green Nuclear Deal was an idea to, articulate a bold but pragmatic vision for what new nuclear building and a new nuclear industrial policy in the U.S. could look like. And at the same time, I'm talking about, or I want to be talking about building new nuclear. I just moved back to Chicago, and it's announced that Exelon is going to close 2 of its 6 nuclear plants. And that's 4.2 gigawatts of carbon-free power. That's 30% of Illinois' clean energy. So I thought, okay, how can we even talk about building anything new when we're still
losing what we have,
dismantling carbon-free infrastructure? I mean, it seems so crazy.
To dismantle it is going to require carbon. It's going to
exactly. And what would be replacing that would be coal, both from Illinois and Indiana. So luckily, I helped start a campaign to protect those 2 plants, and legislation was passed in 2021. They're continuing to operate. And actually, if you're in the ComEd area, you got, during the energy crisis of 2022, you got a massive refund on your electricity bills because of the nuclear legislation that was passed. Wow. That was undercutting fossil fuels, which suddenly became much more expensive. So campaign.
That's such a tangible thing. I feel like people should all know about that. I don't think I personally remember getting my my check in the mail.
And of course, on the bill, they would never put pro nuclear discount. It was something like,
reimbursement,
REC or ZEC credit. Yeah, zero carbon energy credit. They would never say, oh, it's because nuclear plants are now suddenly really cheap and printing money compared to fossil fuels. But that's what so it's a mix of protecting what we have and then also articulating what a new build might look like.
Yeah. I've never thought about it through the framework of reindustrialization. Like, but it is an industrial process. It is like a piece of infrastructure as well. It would employ people. Like it's an industry. Like it's
and it's like there's this term, an advantageous industry, which is basically one that enables further industry and industrialization. And you think about it, it's just because it requires, a lot of engineers. It requires a civil workforce. It requires it's needed everywhere. Yeah. So building up these trades, it requires so many trades, everything to pipe fitters, to carpenters, it would jumpstart a lot of what we need to get back into manufacturing in the US.
Yeah. This is something that we both really care about, is like US manufacturing, and also like supply chain frustrations, like what you're talking about with America not making masks. Like we, as Exposed, like we had set up this extremely fragile system where just the cheapest materials chase the cheapest labor around the world until it gets to you in this very like tenuous way. And if one part breaks, then it all comes falling down. And so like that's also what the fossil fuel economy feels like as well, where our like lifestyle of like subsidized cheap gas is reliant on our like political connections with the Middle East and like all of that stuff. That just seems like an inherently fragile setup. Like if we could do something more locally.
Yeah, and we see that, as soon as Russia becomes persona non grata, then we have this energy crisis because it's, should Germany continue to build a pipeline to import gas straight from Russia? Should we be importing? I mean, this is a real question for the nuclear industry, too, is that about 20% of our fuel came from Russia. And so can we step up and replace those capabilities? It is a bit like, really, did we not think that any of these geopolitical connections were going to come back and bite us in the butt at some point? Yeah. I think there's a lot to be said about paying more, or at least maybe not. I would make the argument that in the end, you would not be paying more. It would be better for society if you reshored some of these things. But in the interim, paying more to have that security of supply at home.
It has value. Like it has, it's like, yes, you're paying up front, but like, I don't know, I'm always pretty risk averse in a lot of things. And why be beholden to your political relations with another country when you could make it yourself? Like,
and I think that I read this week that Biden signed a bill to like ban radioactive purchases from Russia, like, which we were getting 20%. Do you think that's going to impact the price at all of those materials for now?
That's a good question. Maybe temporarily. I mean, this uranium is just so cheap and we're getting so much better at mining. Like even as opposed to, these big you think of mining and you think of the big pits. Now we're able to mine. It's called in situ mining, which is just pulling uranium from salt water or from seawater.
Wow.
And so it's just not very invasive and it's so abundant. People ask, why don't we recycle? Because it's just so cheap to get new uranium. And so I think the expensive part is going to be putting in the centrifuges and getting the experience and competency with doing that at home. And, what's probably more likely is we're just going to turn to Canada, who does this, or like the Netherlands, other allies that are deemed more safe, and just continue to purchase it through the global market. But it's definitely going to have an impact, certainly.
Did you know the Dutch were mining uranium?
They're more like fuel fabrication.
Oh,
yeah.
Interesting. But yeah, and so we've been talking about clean energy. So why when people think clean energy, they picture them more like, they picture two things. They picture solar panels and wind turbines.
Yep.
And so why should we build nuclear power plants instead of just solely like putting our money on wind and solar?
I mean, the simple answer is that nuclear can substitute directly for fossil fuels while wind and solar can't. What do I mean by that? Fossil fuels, the plants are pretty straightforward. You can run them 24/7. You can turn them up, turn them down, turn them on, turn them off. And nuclear works in that same way. It's reliable, it's resilient, it provides what we call baseload power. with solar and wind, you have this intermittency problem. You have the resources when it's there, and you need to be prepared for them to go to zero at any time and still meet the full needs of the grid if you're going to maintain current society. Yeah. So if you're building a largely renewable system, you have two options. And one option is not meeting the needs of society. You just decide to put yourselves at the mercy of the weather. But I don't think anyone wants that. As you were saying, like the whole wear a sweater message is not extremely compelling. And it's particularly devastating for the least well-off among us in society. Or you basically have to build the backup generation, the storage capacity, the transmission necessary to keep the lights on at all times. And what you get is a really expensive system that still prioritizes or incentivizes austerity. And to be clear, that's a path that some countries and states have been heading down, but it's never been proven at scale. Germany and California have been the two leading examples. They've probably invested the most money, time, energy, and gotten the largest build out of solar and wind. And they're both turning back towards fossil fuels that they had previously retired. Oh, wow. So Germany is currently raising ancient forests to get more lignite coal, so very dirty coal. Wow. And California is in an emergency turning back on, bringing back from the dead its natural gas plants to keep the lights on.
Wow. I've heard about California too, like purchasing electricity from other states that's not made from renewable resources, but dirty. It's like a technicality where like it's energy.
Right.
That feels like so nakedly political of like California still gets to say that it's like green, but because they're exchanging dollars in order to buy like dirty energy.
Right. And then the trick is they'll also say, no, but we're also exporting our clean energy. But that's because they have to. They've built so much wind and solar that they have these gluts when it's super sunny.
During a sunny, windy week.
They have to get rid of it.
They can't use it. They can't store it.
Right. And so fortunately, other states around them don't have the same renewables penetration that they do and can accept that. But think about it. This system only works because not everyone is on that system. Yeah. If suddenly they don't have energy to import because all of their neighbors also don't have energy to send, or they all get this massive glut at the same time and there's no one to
sell it to.
I mean, it doesn't make sense when it becomes that large a part of your grid. And meanwhile, nuclear has this proven historical track record of deep decarbonization. So we talked about the OPEC oil crisis. In response to that, France said, look, we don't want to be at the mercy of oil in the Middle East. So we're just going to do this crazy state-led build out of nuclear power plants in the 60s and 70s. And now they enjoy one of the lowest carbon intensity of electricity grids in the world. They get somewhere between 60 and 70% of their electricity from nuclear. And so right now, or the last I checked, this data might be about a year or two old, their power was between 8 and 10 times cleaner than Germany's for half to a third of the cost. Yeah. So they achieved deep decarbonization decades before deep decarbonization was even a goal.
Yeah.
And same with Ontario. They refurbished some nuclear plants and were able to phase out coal completely and end smog days. So, there's a wide range of feelings about climate change and how serious it is, right? Between like the doomers who are like, we have 12 years and people who are like, like we don't.
Quality of life is going to decrease lightly over time. And
right. Yeah. But whatever time frame that you think that it becomes a problem, like it is a problem. All else equal, we probably shouldn't be altering the atmosphere, the composition of our atmosphere as much as we are. So when I'm looking at that problem, I'm not interested in taking unnecessary risk.
Yeah.
I'm interested in safe bets. So I want the thing that's proven that we know can exist at scale, not something that we're crossing our fingers and hand waving about a bunch of future technology to hope we can make work.
Yeah. I think that really drives with an outlook we always come back to, which is that like, has it been done before? Has it been done for tens or like hopefully hundreds of years? Or are we doing something totally untested? When we talk
Lindy
about
effects.
How like the best streets in cities are built is slowly like over time using an established thing, and then versus just an all at once, like something we've never tried, but let's see how it works. Like, I mean, yeah, nothing ventured, nothing gained, but you can't just experiment on like everything when people's like livelihoods are on the line.
Well, and it's interesting that a lot of the people who claim, you know, who fall on that doomer end of the spectrum, who are like, this is the biggest problem we're facing and it's short term, it's here right now, are also like, so we can't use nuclear. We don't want that, but we're going to risk it all on a system that we've never seen done before. All the chips. And it's like, that's an interesting strategy.
Yeah, definitely. And then we want to ask about your most viral moment you've had, which is when you posted a photo of yourself standing next to a nuclear waste storage site while 27 weeks pregnant. What was you were at the Idaho National Laboratory? Where did this all come from?
Yeah, I mean, wow, that was insane to hear out loud. Yeah. So I've long believed that nuclear waste, the problem with nuclear waste is not a technical problem. We've solved that decades before. We manage waste completely safely and easily now. But it's an information problem because people think nuclear waste has a problem. And I think why that is there's just so little waste and it's managed without fanfare. So no one sees it. No one knows what it looks like. We saw it in The Simpsons.
Yeah.
So that's why like this imaginary idea of waste can dominate the culture because we don't know what it actually looks like.
So everyone, I would say, is picturing 50-gallon drums, probably black, and then oozing out of the top of them is green ooze. And then on the side of the barrel is the nuclear symbol. And that's what nuclear waste is. And so when people think about storage, they think maybe 100 of those barrels and they're in a cave.
Or in a tree like Mr. Burns and Smithers, like shoving it in, like, you can fit one more. Yeah. And so then when I feel like when you show people, no, it's actually like really boring and benign. It's solid. It's not liquid. It just sits in these big steel and concrete casks. There's no moving parts.
Yeah, they look really gray.
Yeah, they're like
concrete.
They're really boring, which I think is a problem.
They're non-architecture. They're like there's a non-thing.
We can beautify waste. That's going to be one of my future projects. But when you show people, they're like, oh, that's it. And you can almost feel them relax in the middle of the conversation. So I'm at Idaho National Lab with another advocate, and we're doing this little driving tour, and they say, oh, yeah, we can drive past the 3-mile island waste, the melted reactor core. We keep that here on site, and it's in dry cask storage. I was like, can I see it? Can I? And it was this huge, big issue because, you know, the industry is so heavily regulated and people are just terrified, like, of doing any sort of like optics or PR that they almost make themselves seem creepy and scary because they're not.
Because they don't want to mess it up. Like they think that no information is better than bad information, which I guess, but like opacity scares people with stuff like this.
Totally. And it's why that green leaky thing continues to persist.
Because there's no replacement image for it.
Right. And so I thought, you know, if I can get in there and get this picture, that could do a lot for showing, you know, I think most people, aside from a few like unhinged folks on Twitter and trolls, understand that a mother is not going to do anything to like expose her child to risk just for the retweets.
Yeah.
And so after like 30 minutes of just like a bunch of walkie-talkies, like, can we do this? Can we make, they know that there's no radiation coming from this waste. It's more like, can we allow them to take pictures here? What if this gets out? And so, you know, with permission, I did tweet it, and I would say the response was mostly positive or like, wow, I didn't know that.
Yeah.
There were definitely some like, what a terrible mom. Like, yeah, I mean, I was definitely at risk of tripping and falling on the concrete pad for sure. But I do think it managed to change a few hearts and minds based on some
it has to have,
very nice DMs I got. So.
Or at least like starts the conversation with
Absolutely.
people too. Yeah. The fact that you had to take an image and tweet of it shows that, like, as we'll touch on later in this, like there needs to be a replacement image. There needs to be something in people's minds. Like if this energy crisis that we have, it's so hard to like visualize. I think about it in the housing crisis. That's something that's also hard to visualize. Like there were those images of like crowds of people outside of rental listings in New York. Like that's one of the few ways you can visualize the housing crisis. Like if you're trying to like show housing scarcity, like it's hard to show a house that doesn't exist. Like, you can take a photo of a lot, but that doesn't do a lot. Like I've almost thought that like the other way you can show it is by like taking a NIMBY type person and showing them just a video of a young couple looking at Zillow and getting really sad when they realize they can't like live and raise their kids somewhere. Like, but that's such a hard thing to visualize.
Right.
You know?
I've seen TikToks like that though, where like it's someone's mom and they're like, oh yeah, my son, you know, he said it's hard to find a house, but I started looking at houses with him and they're all like dangerous and falling apart.
Those viral videos of like boomers guess house prices. They get $50,000.
Right.
It's like,
I think the guessing game is actually really important too, because you have these thoughts. And then when someone's actually asking, like, can you articulate that? You're forced to think about it in a more serious way. And then you're often surprised by what the truth is. So I always ask people, like, can you describe nuclear waste to me? Like, tell me what you're thinking. And then I show them and they have to reckon with the fact that they just said one thing and it's completely different. And at least, you know, some people, that's a little too cheeky, like they feel a little embarrassed. And so it's not always a great strategy. But for some who are genuinely interested and it really opens them up. Like, what else could I be wrong about? What else might I not know that I thought I knew?
Yeah. So yeah, we're now going to get into discourse around nuclear energy. So when we're deciding like ideas for episodes, we like to keep it pretty brief. I think that's one of the nice things is our titles aren't too random. But there are some terms like aesthetics. We could have done nuclear aesthetics for this episode, but that we want to reserve it because we're all about aesthetics. But I think discourse is really important because with nuclear energy, the reasons why people oppose this like very safe technology doesn't come from their scientific knowledge. It comes from cultural depictions. And so that's what we're going to get into today. But something I learned through working on the docket with you this week is that basically the fears of nuclear energy sort of predate the technology itself to an extent, where people saw and reacted to the dropping of 2 atomic bombs in Japan before the first like nuclear reactor ever started getting built in the United States. But you brought up this film, The China Syndrome. I've never heard of that.
Oh, really?
That's crazy.
Maybe
it's used
I
all
have,
the time.
but I assumed it was about China.
Like a young Jane Fonda. I don't remember if that's like her breakout role. I mean, I think she was, but it was a big deal.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So yeah, as you mentioned, this movie came out, I think 12 days before the 3 Mile Island incident. And it's about a nuclear facility melting down.
Yes. And I think there's even a line in the film that's like, if it melted down, it would wipe an area the size of Pittsburgh, or it was some place in Pennsylvania uninhabitable. And then 12 days later in Pennsylvania, a nuclear I mean, you can't make that shit up.
Yeah, that's a rough. That's like, you can try
so
all the good
brutal.
PR you want, but like that's going to be a tough one. That's a lot to ask of people, to be like, no, actually there's a nuance behind this. Please stop.
And especially, you know, getting back to the opacity, the one thing that was pretty true about the 3 Mile Island Netflix show is that like the public relations or just the communication around it was so bad. Like the industry did such a terrible job. I'm hearing it and trying to step back and think, okay, knowing what I know now, hindsight, we have the benefit of hindsight. If we didn't, I would probably be scared shitless of that too. Like they did a just awful job. So the timing is brutal.
Yeah. So I think the origins of this fear of nuclear energy, they come from the conflation of nuclear weapons with nuclear energy. And yeah, you sort of said that to a degree on the Decouple podcast. I listened to an episode you did with them.
Yeah.
If the weapons came first, like culture had to retool its mindset around this being actually a source of energy and not just a way for us to inflict like military will on other countries.
Right. And so first, one part of this, like where did this fear come from, is it actually predated not just nuclear energy, but like nuclear technology altogether. I think Spencer Wirt is an engineer who wrote this fantastic book called The Rise of Nuclear Fear. I highly recommend it. But he argues that in the early 1900s or even in the late 1800s, with the Industrial Revolution and just progress in scientific discovery, that there was already this idea of immense destructive power and uncontrollable energy in the end of the world. And you see that in like H.G. Wells' The War of the Worlds or The World Set Free. And so then nuclear energy comes along and it's like crazy. You're splitting this tiny particle of matter and it's creating a bomb that can decimate a city. You know, it just fits that description so perfectly. And then the other thing is, advocates get really upset when I say this, but it is hard to distinguish nuclear weapons from nuclear energy technologies because you don't get the nuclear energy technology without the bomb. You know, the rush to the bomb is how you get fission. And our first nuclear plants come out of the capabilities or the military industrial complex. So it's Rickover is a nuclear Navy guy who then builds Shippingport, the first U.S. nuclear reactor. And it's based on the reactors that are powering naval submarines. So you can understand like this technology that we just saw end a war is now coming to your backyard. Is a bit of a, again, you have to admit, it's a hard sell.
Hard sells. I was going to use it at first. It doesn't mean it's impossible. Yeah, it just has to be acknowledged. You can either hand wave it and be like, no, that's done. That's in the past. Or say like, that's where it came from. But like a technology like on its own is not evil, bad, anything. It is a technology. Like we build the cultural system around it that dictates its use.
Right. And I think so much of the anti-nuclear sentiment came from the anti-war sentiment where, okay, we can't really stop proliferation. It seems to be happening regardless of how much we are doing. But what we can stop is them putting this in our backyards. And so you do see this shift from fighting nuclear weapons to fighting nuclear power plants.
In terms of like early anti-nuclear like fiction or just media, I don't know. You ever heard of By the Waters of Babylon?
No.
So I didn't remember this till like right now, but this was a post-apocalyptic short story. It's by Stephen Vincent Benet. It's from 1937. And it follows a guy in a post-apocalyptic like New York area, and he's like going to some place of the gods. It's showing like, human culture has been almost like eradicated and it's been slowly rebuilt. And there's like, people are living in a kind of hunter-gatherer state. So this guy is traveling across the Udison River, which is the Hudson. Like, so we've retained some words like that. And he talks about how anything metal is from the before times and it is bad to touch because you'll have like a disease from it or something. You'll die early. And so it shows that like we have this, like this is before the nuclear bomb was even detonated. And we have this fear of like, oh yes, the lingering poison of nuclear.
Right. I think we'll get into some of the more like psychology a little later on, but I do think just like the immense change. Thunder.
Wow.
Perfect backdrop. That just the immense change that people saw, like the way that science was advancing. I think that was probably pretty disorienting, and especially in a world that was starting to lose traditional religion. And so I think the apocalypse or envisioning the end of the world is actually sort of reassuring. I know that sounds crazy, but it gives limits. It's orienting in a way that, the unknown of future progress does not give that same feeling. That's a bit woo-woo, but that's sort of my thought behind it.
I like the woo-woo.
That's a good theory.
I think that like when we start to think about nuclear annihilation, I mean, seeing Oppenheimer, and they talk about that brief period where people wondered if a nuclear reaction would be, forever sustaining and essentially like light the entire atmosphere on fire.
Right.
And we'd all end. I think there's something of like, if you do believe in an idea of God, it's saying like, oh, he hasn't been able to wipe us out yet, but we could do it ourselves. There's almost something like that we're now living on our own terms, I think, with nuclear power, that like the ability to end the human existence is almost an empowering thing.
Right. And in that movie, they keep saying, it's non-zero. Like it's not zero risk. And I think for a lot of people, that's really scary. Like, you're saying it wasn't zero, because what they want is the reassurance. And obviously there are so many things that are non-zero risk. Like that's just how you communicate. Like this is technically possible. I think they really played it up in the movie.
Because it's a movie.
Yeah, exactly. It makes great cinema. But in real life, they're like, I mean, it's not zero, but it's such a small tail risk event. But people want the reassurance of, we know that that's not going to happen. And that's what makes nuclear, I think, again, very uncomfortable for folks, is like, how do we know? How can you promise us that this will never happen?
Yeah. So now we can get, I think, into some media that was created after nuclear reactors came online. And these were also, released after largely the 3 Mile Island and Chernobyl nuclear accidents occurred. But I think they depict, fears around nuclear energy and radioactive material in different ways. So with The Simpsons, we'll start out with talking about sort of like subtle radioactive contamination. And then we'll talk about Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, which is like more outlandish. And then we'll talk about like Chernobyl and how that depicts like a full-on nuclear meltdown. So with the first one, The Simpsons, I think that this one shows like subtle nuclear contamination or radioactive contamination through like the nuclear plant that Homer works at. I mean, even the intro of the show, the cutscenes, they show like Homer accidentally getting like a nuclear rod in the back of his shirt.
Yeah, classic. Yeah.
And then as he's driving home, he like pulls it out and he throws it out the window. But I think you see this especially in the early seasons, because I feel like with TV shows in general, they stick to the world they're in a little bit more closely in the first season or two. But like in the second season, there's this fish with 3 eyes that I think Bart fishes out of a river called Blinky. And it shows that like the nuclear plant in Springfield is like slowly contaminating the natural environment.
Yeah. I mean, I grew up watching The Simpsons. Personally, early Simpsons. I haven't watched it for a while now, but I think it's important to put Matt Groening into context a bit, So he's someone who was born in Portland in the 60s. So growing up during the Cold War and at the burgeoning environmental movement. And then he goes to Evergreen State College, which is like very famously the hippy dippy college that doesn't have any majors or grades. So, and he admits, the show definitely has a liberal slant.
Yeah.
So when you look at it like that, and the idea that it's supposed to be this satirical parody of a middle class American family, its depiction of the environment is also like just a cartoonized version of what the environmental movement was saying, which is that like large, evil capitalist corporations are killing the environment with greed and there's no recourse. It's almost just nonchalant, right? It's just like,
they almost do it to do it sometimes.
Right.
Like,
that's just how the river is. And there's no changing that. I think what The Simpsons also does beyond this, like the idea of the idea of radiation just being this casual thing that happens because of nuclear, it's also this pushback against nuclear as an industry. Nuclear, I think, really does represent institutional lock-in for a lot of people. It's, big government involvement and bureaucracy. It requires most of the time a monopoly utility to have the capital and capability to build it. And it's super highly regulated. It has connections to the military industrial complex.
But also to like academia too. It requires a constant stream of extremely educated people.
Yes, exactly. So I think that's something that's also very prevalent in the show. And it stands in stark contrast to this environmental libertarian vision of actually we're all going to be our own energy gardeners.
We're going to stick a solar panel on our house.
Yes, exactly.
And that's going to get us
originally
there.
thought I think we forget because renewables have gotten so big. Now we have these industrial solar farms and these big wind turbines across the landscape, that the original vision was called the soft energy pathway, where it's, you would have panels on your home and you'd have an actual windmill in your backyard and you would be able to meet your own energy needs. And if it was lower energy than you would have liked, that was good because that was the entire point. Renewables were never supposed to actually power modernity.
Yeah.
That feels like such an American approach to it. We want things that look like they are self-sustaining and stuff. That's why we love single family homes. They look, I'm independent, but because you can't visually see the sewer system, the natural gas pipeline, the power system of all these things that like the infrastructure that serves you. We want it to feel like we are self-sustaining, like we're little farmers or something, but we're not. We're a part of a infrastructure network.
I mean, I was talking with a friend about this, that there's no new frontier. We were built like America. The idea was you would just go explore.
We always talk about this. America
Yeah.
starts to freak out when there's not a frontier.
Right.
Yeah.
And so it's still this idea that somehow we can go back to that of being
Homesteaders.
Exactly. And I don't think that's possible or desirable, but
It's it's a fantasy. It's it's a van life. It's an off the grid thing.
I have some cousins, older stay-at-home moms, where they like to really fantasize about the homestead lifestyle, and they share videos from accounts where people are like, "Oh, I collect my own rainwater. And here are my chickens that lay eggs, and I'm feeding them to my babies." And
and it's that only works because you have the entire safety net of society behind you.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that's always people you'll do all that, but what if you get tetanus? Are you you have to go to an established hospital and get treatment for, or you get rabies or anything like that? No, you exist in a safety net. You can go around and you can play as though you're I think Robinson Crusoe, but
I almost have more sympathy for it now than I did because there really is no opt-out feature anymore, right? And I do think that can kind of be scary or
feel
just
you're boxed in a bit. Yeah.
And I think that's, again, nuclear is just the perfect example of that. And I think, especially look at nuclear weapons. If a country gets a nuclear bomb, that whatever regime is there is kind of locked in, right? They suddenly have the trump card. And I think in some ways, I mean, this is a bit weird to be talking about on a podcast about nuclear energy, but it can be stabilizing and the regime can be better because they don't have the fear of invasion, But
it's one of those interesting paradoxes of how nuclear stuff brought us into an era of relative prosperity, or at least it made large scale pitched battle much less possible between two nuclear forces.
Right. I mean, it's trade-offs, but you can't trade that's the trade-off. You are locked into that. And so I think that definitely also has an impact when people are expressing fears of nuclear. It's that this is the society we have now.
Another example I thought of that sort of deals with fears around subtle radioactive contamination is this artist Cornelia Hesse-Honegger. Had you heard of her before?
No, I hadn't.
Yeah, she's someone I read about in this really good book called Insectopedia. And it's this, it was written in this interesting way where it's each chapter is a letter of the alphabet. And I think she's letter H, I think, or possibly C. But anyways, she is not that famous in the art world, but she's someone who comes out of the art world. And she's an illustrator, a Swiss illustrator who she finds insects, she collects them. Some of the insects she collects are from actual places where nuclear accidents have happened, like 3 Mile Island, Fukushima, Chernobyl. But she also goes to like standard nuclear power plants where there's never been an accident. She finds insects there. But then after she collects them, she illustrates them, the ones that have mutations, to show like, oh, like, look, they're contaminating the environment, and look at all these abnormalities. Isn't it sad that these bugs have 2 eyes, or their wings are deformed?
Man's corruption of nature. Look what we've done to this perfect, unspoiled place.
Yeah, but the book, it writes about her in an interesting way where like her work isn't artistically interesting enough to get her to be that famous, but it also isn't scientific enough to make her scientifically famous. Yeah. She's sort of in both worlds, but yeah,
this kind of makes me angry.
I don't know. Did either of you get a chance to look at her?
Yeah,
art?
I looked at her work. Yeah, it's just, I don't know. It's got the vibe of those like cartoons that are like, wow, it really makes you think. Yeah. Like that kind of stuff. Like, wow, people are on their phones a lot nowadays. Like
Banksy.
It's that like Banksy level kind of commentary. And the fact that she has like, it's oh man, that's a rough card to not have the academic or scientific ability, but she still feels like she needs to be seen.
I mean, I think she still has I think she's artistically talented, but I just think like we're past illustration, honestly. Contemporary art is not based around what she's doing very much. But I think something about her work is very European. Or it's just like, what can I feel like is a worthy cause?
Yeah.
Right. And it's really frustrating because I don't think people understand how devastating the fear of nuclear can be. Not nuclear, but the fear of nuclear. So, Fukushima is actually a really good example where in hindsight, we know that no one should have been evacuated.
Yeah.
If they had stayed put, that would have been the most safe option. But instead, the prefecture was evacuated in the middle of a natural disaster and 2,000 people died because of panic, because of fear of radiation. And so then, in 2015, you see this daisy go viral, the Fukushima daisy, which had like 3 heads and was kind of thick and
it's
weird
Blinky.
looking.
It's Blinky the fish.
It's Blinky. And for as many people pointed out that, no, this is actually a common daisy mutation. We see it all over the world. The difference was, this was Fukushima. So clearly this is because of nuclear and humans being bad. And it's even more insidious. One that really bothers me is Chernobyl heart. It's when children have, physical disabilities or mutations that because they're in Ukraine, because they're near the exclusion zone, it gets, this is because of Chernobyl, which I think is a very convenient excuse to not say, no, this is just a lot of impoverished people not having access to healthcare. So you can kind of write it away. Like there's nothing to be done about that instead of, no, these children are living in poverty and deeply need healthcare. Instead, you raise money for your various anti-nuclear organizations around that.
I noticed this. There's this whole like Chernobyl children like nonprofit apparatus that seems to be run by very well-to-do British women who like vacation out to there to go like look at the orphanage and stuff and then go solicit money for it. And looking at the kids and the conditions they have, this is not common. This isn't stuff that you can draw a concrete line from nuclear stuff. Like one kid had like hydrocephaly that wasn't treated at birth. That's something that can just happen. If you don't install like a shunt in someone's head, then it can be very terrible and that affects them the rest of their life. Like that's irrespective of nuclear power, but it's just turned into this whole like, I don't know, people want to draw lines where they're not there.
And on nuclear power propaganda, I just remembered I had a Japanese exchange student for 3 days who was touring the U.S. She was from Ibaraki, where the Fukushima disaster happened. But she was only at my high school for a few days. And she, along with all the other students, there were at least like 50. They all gave a presentation on like the earthquake and what happened at Fukushima. And now I'm looking back on it and I'm like, was that just like nuclear energy propaganda?
Right. It's like, 20,000 people died and it's, I think, what was it? 2,000 from the evacuation, like I think it was 2 workers died. They got trapped in the basement of the nuclear power plant and it flooded, but that was it. Yeah. And so, it was truly the fear that caused that devastation. I think it's impossible to sort of separate that from, the children of Chernobyl drives me insane because I went to Ireland for work back, I think it was in 2022. And even while I was staying with a friend, in her mailbox, she found a Children of Chernobyl flyer like, hey, if you have these things, donate. And every year, what was her name? It's like Heidi Roach, or I forget her name, but the woman who runs it brings this group of Chernobyl children to Ireland for Christmas. And I'm like,
trots them around.
Honestly, sorry, I hope I can swear. It's fucked up because you're showing like, look at how great our lives are because we have access to reliable electricity and healthcare, and like you show them this amazing lifestyle for 2 weeks and then they
take them back and then they
take them back. And it's like, no wonder they think they're victims and they're being told like, oh, you're a victim because you've been exposed. Like, it's just so insidious. And I think it's going to, until we sort of nip that in the bud, every subsequent nuclear energy accident, no matter how benign, no matter how inconsequential to the environment or human health, is going to be a disaster.
Yeah. People they're looking for Blinky. Basically, they want to find like those things. If anything nuclear happens, they just go searching like, all right, what's weird here? What's wrong?
And we're just most people think of radiation as something that we are not exposed to. And if you're not careful and you go near an industrial facility or a nuclear plant, you might get a dose of it. We are awash in radiation. Like the entire earth is radioactive. Our bones have radioactive decay. Like the granite in our ground is going to have far more of an impact on your DNA and genetic material than the nuclear plant. But people don't realize that. That's sort of,
something I was reminded of this week is like, I'm really big on bananas. I eat like 3 a day often. And they have like a little bit more than you'd think. But it's not really unsafe for me to eat bananas.
Right. I mean, there's a whole, like right now, Fukushima, do we release the wastewater, the treated water into the ocean? And it's basically like, if you drank a liter of it, you would be basically eating a banana or a Brazil nut. I forget. I did the calculation, but we're talking about just such small amounts. But because we don't realize, radiation is actually very natural, it's seen as, even just a little contamination is bad for you.
No, it's like flight attendants and pilots have higher rates of cancer because they're constantly in a thinner atmosphere layer where they're less protected from the sun's radiation. Like, no, we live in a world of constant low-level radiation.
So I'm working on a piece right now about Hanford, the weapons complex. Right now, it's an EPA Superfund site. It's, going to cost, I think the estimate is now $580 billion of cleanup. It's the DOE's largest line item budget. And what we are protecting against, we've seen the modeling. If nothing is done, if we just let it go, everyone leaves tomorrow, the year of peak dose, so, whatever is remaining somehow seeps into the rock, makes its way to the Columbia River. The year of peak dose is almost the year 5,000. It's like 4,996. And if you drank the water and ate from the river, you would get the same annual radiation dose as a single round trip flight from New York to LA. We are spending $500 billion to prevent that from happening in the year 5,000. Like, that's how deep this goes.
Wow.
It's,
No. You can get more radiation from, you probably know about this, but Fiestaware. Do you know about this?
No.
So Fiestaware is the cute, like, it started in the 1930s or so, this like colorful pottery made in the US.
Yeah.
But there was the orange plates. They got the coloring from this soil that they just dug out of somewhere in like Utah. I forget the story behind this, but like the if you have an orange Fiestaware plate that's a genuine one from like before the 40s or 50s, like throw it away. Like that one is actually like radioactive. Like, and that's not because it's from a nuclear test site or anything. It's just
the
radioactive.
Type of soil, yeah.
I think I have to search that. We might have to cut that out, but I don't know.
Yeah. No, with ceramics, actually, like it's hard to get bright colors that are food safe, like red in particular. Like food safe red is like very expensive. But yeah, so that's like subtle nuclear contamination that like, yes, animals can mutate. There are mutations in nature like that occur naturally. But there's also like outlandish nuclear contamination. And I think a good example of this is Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, which has had many iterations and many different shows have come out and movies. But are both of you familiar a little bit at least? Okay.
Wait, I have a correction if we could edit this in. So, sorry. No, the FiestaWare was, they used uranium in the glaze, actually. But then the U.S. government confiscated all of their uranium after the nuclear project started. So this was in the pre-nuclear era. So I don't know. Let's cut this out.
It's like uranium glass. You can, it's like bowls that you can shine a UV light on and they glow because there's uranium in the glass.
Yeah.
Sorry, where you were.
But yeah, in Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, the turtles mutated from coming into contact with something called the ooze, which Master Shredder then steals the remaining ooze and then mutates all these other animals that are then the bad guys in the show. But yeah, I think this idea of like radioactive green gooey slime that mutates things was really prolific in the 80s and the 90s. It is like very common to see this across cartoons and media. And I think another place we can look at it too is with slime from Nickelodeon.
Oh, yeah.
But yeah, I wanted to talk about this, and we can talk about this largely from an aesthetic angle, because I think this has less to do with public fears around radioactive material. I think it does proliferate the idea of it being a liquid, but I don't think people think, you know, if an animal like touches this material, it's actually going to mutate to the degree that Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles is depicting.
Yeah.
Right. I think radiation becomes a very convenient plot device for science fiction and cartoons because it's like, you know, got one foot in reality, right? That, we can cause genetic changes. And so you see everything from it can create something huge, like huge ants, or it can shrink you down to the size of a microbe. And you get these paradoxical adaptations because anything under the sun is possible once you start mutating genes. And I think, again, that's why it's used in Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. And it's like a kernel of truth. It's kind of reality, you know?
It's like gamma radiation for the Hulk, a radioactive spider for Spider-Man. Like these all come out of like the 60s when like we really started talking about this stuff.
Yeah. Something I realized just, you know, after recording this episode while thinking about things is maybe the reason why it's depicted as green comes from glow in the dark stuff.
Yeah. I mean, when you were sort of throwing this question to me, I thought I've never really thought about that before. And the thing that I thought of, or a theory that I think is probably most accurate, is that in the 1900s, they started using radium with phosphorescent paint.
Yeah.
So the radioactive decay from radium would make the paint light up, and you could put it on watches and dials and glow in the dark, and it was cool. And then the radium girls became pretty infamous because they all got really sick, and it turned out that the radium was poisoning them. So I think it's this like visually very impactful way to show radiation danger. Yeah. And I think probably other things like slime, goo, green, just separate from radiation to, for whatever reason, elicit disgust or bad.
Yeah, because it's the idea that slime, toxic waste, radioactive material, that these things are green is culturally constructed. Like, to me, it feels like so ingrained because I was exposed to these ideas in childhood.
Right.
And I was just like, where is this coming from? I think part of it could be, like, this is something I'll link in the show notes. I feel like most people have heard of this at this point, but like, scientific studies have shown that like people experience colors more vividly in childhood. So like the greens you see as a kid, when you reflect back on those memories, they seem even more like bright and vivid than they do now as an adult. And I think that's true. Like that Nickelodeon slime green is just like the brightest it could have ever looked to me.
Yeah, it's like green screen green almost.
Yeah.
Yeah,
like day glow green, which day glow colors, you probably know the history more than I do.
I don't think
you know
so.
the history about everything, but no, they're just like, if you think about Goosebump covers, like how bright those were, they started using day glow colors like after a while, and that's why they're like so striking to children. But yeah, they were developed, I think, as a military technology, and then they came into consumer products. They're just like really
many
bright.
good things are.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah,
that's really interesting.
But yeah, on like pollution aesthetics, I think that like baby boomers became active in the environmental movement and they started to make media for children, which then reflected their ideas. And so I do think that, as you mentioned, like this slime and mutation can just be like convenient plot devices, but there are also like more explicit times when they did want to talk about radioactive waste and radioactive contamination, like a really big one being Captain Planet, which I actually saw, I watched it on TV at the tail end of when it was being shown.
I was going to say, yeah, I feel like I just missed it. Yeah.
Yeah, but this is, there's no better way to say this, but I feel like I was kind of like a hipster kid.
Like, yeah, it's like you like the older stuff, even when you were 7, you like the stuff from the previous era.
No, I would go to like collectible toy stores as a kid and be like, I want the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtle figurines from the 90s, even though there were like new ones coming out in the 2000s, but I would just had like such exquisite taste as a child.
Yeah, that's really fun.
But yeah, Captain Planet was one of those shows where like I caught it on its tail end and then I was like obsessed with it. Even though this was pre-internet, I couldn't even Google it to like look at it. But I remember I actually tried to write a petition and maybe my mom even sent it into Cartoon Network because I wanted it back on air.
Bring it back.
Bring it back.
I don't know why, but I guess like for me as like a little kid, care was like a big value that came to me through my 90s obsession with Care Bears. Okay, that was a bit more gay of me. But Care Bears and then Captain Planet. But yeah, Captain Planet is really interesting. I think it like depicts this like way of thinking about the environment that I think is way more prevalent in the boomer generation, where it's very like anti-development. The best way I would like characterize this is being like conservationist,
as opposed to environmentalism.
Yeah, it's like a very particular way of thinking about the environment.
Yeah, I mean, Captain Planet, I had to go look at it back in like 2017 or 2018 because my boss was trying to describe it to me and I just didn't believe. I was like, what? This is so weird. And I watched a few episodes and it's basically Captain Planet was peak anti-human environmentalism where humans were the antagonists and it was greed and negligence that was degrading the environment and the environment had to be protected from humans. And, you know, it's interesting because I think a much rosier read of things like deforestation and pollution are that as societies move from subsistence into modernity, there are trade-offs and you have to use more of the environment when you're poor and you are worse to nature, say, when you're poor. But as you get wealthy, you can make the decisions that allow you to set more of nature aside from nature. So we can choose to buy more expensive containers instead of one-use plastics because we're able to recycle. And in fact, if Captain Planet had his way and we just stopped doing all of those things, we would be developing. We would be using so much more of the Earth's resources and suffering abound. It would just be a much more doomy, gloomy vision for the world.
I see where boomers came to that. I remember reading this one book. It was a collection of old slideshows from the 50s. So like, if teachers didn't want to teach in class that day, like there were these like government PSA style slide decks that you would just put on to teach kids stuff. And the book is called Change Your Underwear Twice a Week is the name of it. Because this was like, that's an excerpt from a hygiene one from the 40s and 50s where it's like a good clean boy changes his underwear at least twice a week. But one of the things in it was about like nature, and it opens up and it shows this like just screen of nature. And it says, nature, it is a giant storehouse for man to take and take. No matter how many men there are, we cannot take it all. Like, is one thing they were saying that like boomers were raised with like take all the environment you can. And then slowly over time, as the environmental movement built, it was like a logical overcorrection of like, no, we shouldn't take anything. We should go back to primitivism. I
definitely don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater because I remember reading Silent Spring in college and thinking, holy shit, if even just half of this or a third of this is true, it's really horrifying. And so, it's good that we raised our awareness such that, you know, we could reduce pollution. We could, like, I remember growing up the ozone layer. Like, stayed awake at night panicking about the ozone layer because everyone was just saying like the end of the world is coming. And then actually through smart policy, you don't hear about the ozone layer anymore. So it's not that we shouldn't be concerned. And it's like actually like limitless, like development with any regard for the environment is totally fine. But it's just that there is this middle path where we can be better stewards of the environment and still lift people out of poverty and flourish and create human prosperity.
Yeah. And I think that, again, that like conservation strain of environmentalism, their idea is basically to preserve the systems we have and then scale back and reduce consumption. Instead of simply reducing consumption of fossil fuels, we could also convert over to nuclear energy and have the same amount, if not more energy than before, while it being good for the environment. And yeah, I think that ties into NIMBYism, which we'll circle back to later. But yeah, that whole idea of like just we have progressed enough and we're going to just preserve things and keep them the same is like a very like baby boomer way of thinking.
I like to point out, so I did a presentation for one of the Illinois chapters of the Sierra Club, which I think is one of the most anti-nuclear environmental organizations. That's the epitome of current boomer environmentalism. And I wasn't trying to really troll them, but I was pointing out to them that their founder, or one of the founders and original presidents, Will Seary, was a hardcore conservationist. And he came from, like, he was a climber. He was a mountaineer. So he had an interest in preserving nature to be enjoyed by humans. Yeah. And PG&E comes along in California and says, we're actually going to build a bunch of nuclear plants. And rather than blocking them, he said, actually, nuclear is great. This is the best source of energy that we could possibly hope for. We just have to do this responsibly. So he negotiated with politicians to protect the dunes that they were going to put them on and said, okay, instead of spreading these out, we're going to concentrate all these reactors at a single location. And it's going to be here. You're going to leave these dunes protected. It's going to be slightly more inconvenient of a location for you, and we're going to set aside all this nature around the plant. And I was pointing out, like, that's true conservationism. That was the original idea that, of course, we need power. Of course, people aren't going to give it up, but we just need to be smart about the ways we develop. And now it's just become, any sort of development is bad. Any sort of energy that allows us to live the current lifestyle that we do, or it's like any solution that doesn't require austerity or doesn't dismantle capitalism is no good. And at that point, that's hard to build a society around.
Yeah. I mean, I am still skeptical of what they call in strong towns like a high burn lifestyle. You ever heard that, right? Of like the fact that if it takes, in order to work your job, if you have to start up an internal combustion engine vehicle and start burning gas, like you have a high burn lifestyle. Your whole, like, the energy it takes for you to do your task, if it's very high, that should be, rectified in some kind of way. But I think that it can just be done a little smarter, like if we just have enough power, like we don't need to be.
Right. If electricity is cheap, abundant, reliable, and carbon free, suddenly you can use a lot more and your burn is still a lot less.
Yeah. And then just to circle back to Captain Planet, I did want to bring up that there is a villain in the show called Duke Nukem. Did you hear about him before this week?
No, you introduced me to Duke Nukem.
Yeah, so he's an eco-villain who, for some reason, just wants to contaminate the environment with radioactive material for like no reason. And then also his backstory is never explained. Like, how did he become radioactive? It's never explained. But I actually found this like really interesting Reddit thread from the Captain Planet subreddit where they were
of course there's a Captain Planet subreddit
where they were discussing him, and they were like, why does Duke Nukem reduce Gaia's powers? And they were like having this esoteric discussion about like nuclear materials, and like it was so interesting. But yeah, I think that this does reflect just how baby boomers were trying to show this idea with their children that nuclear energy should be met with suspicion, but without explaining why or making any case. Because on the show, there's really no reason why he's like contaminating the environment or like, it's really sus.
Which is why I think you get a generation like ours that's introduced to nuclear and so many people are open to it.
Yeah.
Like, oh, well, this is really cool. And then you go and talk to your parents about it and they're like, wait, so you like nuclear? Which is just such a funny reaction.
Yeah. It makes you like kind of think that maybe you do just need like generational churn is one of those. You need people who haven't grown up with it. This is a completely bizarre tangent, but I think about like in the Old Testament, they talk about like the Jews wandered in the desert for 40 years. And the reason God made them do that was that this generation that knew slavery had to die. Like, which is such a sad thing of just that, like, we think now with our modern sense, like, no, even if you've been through trauma and terrible things, you can recover and all that. And it's totally true. But I think that a lot of times, like, if a generation has seen a terrible thing, like sometimes they just need to be like let out to pasture as the new generation naturally comes up.
I'm ever the optimist, and I'm like, it's my job. I want to change hearts and minds. I believe that people can see the nuclear light, but I also do think I will lose my job pretty quickly once the boomers shift out of the halls of power. People just won't need that much convincing.
Yeah. It's a good problem to have once you get there. Yeah, you can focus on the next problem to solve.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Find my new cause.
Yeah. And then the last sort of like fear stoked by media around nuclear energy. The third one is nuclear meltdowns. And we'll talk about like the HBO show Chernobyl as part of this. This one, I mean, compared to the other two, this one is a little bit more warranted. Because I mean, there have been 3 accidents. It's not impossible. But yeah, the way they depict it, I think, for me at least, the way I look at like Chernobyl and other shows, like the Netflix show that just came out about 3 Mile Island, is like, it's sort of like Shark Week on National Geographic or the movie Jaws, where like, okay, yeah, shark attacks can happen, but this is like fueling public fears to a degree that almost feels unethical.
Yeah.
This is a weird like shark attack risk visualization aside, but I did the math on it, and the fraternity SAE has killed more people than sharks have since 2000, like through hazing incidents. So like you're more likely to die of an SAE hazing attack than you are like a shark, which is like the wildest stat.
What prompted that?
I don't know how I was in a fraternity and I was saying that like hazing incidents are like real and a threat and all that. And then you look at the stats and you see that like one fraternity is like heavily overrepresented.
Well, that makes me feel better about swimming in the ocean. But yeah, I think, zooming out a bit, people love disaster porn. There's the day after China syndrome, fallout, the road threads, so many examples of just, and again, nuclear becomes this very convenient way to explain how you get there. And Chernobyl, the show, was no exception.
Yeah.
Except that it's even more appealing because it gets to be based on an actual event, and based on is doing a lot of heavy lifting. I mean, I was watching the show and I'm like, it was sort of how I feel about a lot of vaguely anti-nuclear media, where I'm like, I could see why this is so enjoyable and why people love it, but God,
they have an easier job than you have.
Yeah, exactly. And I do think Chernobyl is a perfect example, though, to talk about nuclear fear, because when people are imagining a meltdown, when they're imagining a worst case scenario, they are picturing Chernobyl, whether they know it or not, because Chernobyl was a reactor on fire, completely exposed to the environment, spewing fire and radioactive particles. Like there was no containment. It's just open burn. And yet, despite that being the worst accident in history, there is this huge gap in the scientific understanding of Chernobyl and the popular understanding and what was depicted in the show.
Yeah.
So, for example, the human health impacts. The UN released a report in 2008 that showed that, I don't know how in detail you want me to walk through this, but
let's err on the side of more.
We have you for the detail, because we would not know all of this.
Yeah.
So 3 firefighters died at the accident, at the scene. 28 first responders died, I think, within 2 or 3 weeks of acute radiation syndrome. And then 15 people died from thyroid cancer within the next 25 years that could be attributed to Chernobyl. The report goes on to say that based on the mortality of thyroid cancer, which, look, all cancer, not good. Thyroid cancer is sort of the cancer you want to get if you get cancer, because you can take the thyroid out, you take thyroxine. Yeah. So it's really a question of, do you have adequate health care? But based on the mortality rate, 145 people could be expected to die from thyroid cancer from Chernobyl over the next 40 years or so. Yeah. And the molecular pathologist, Jerry Thomas, she's the director of the Chernobyl Tissue Bank, said, based on the cases we've seen, that number is probably pretty high. So worst accident ever, 200 people dead total, possibly 200 people dead. I mean, that is so different from what people believe. It's barely a blip on the radar compared to industrial accidents of the 1980s, but it looms so large in our heads. Yeah. And then, what about the natural environment? Well, again, the UN put out a report in 2016 that said, after the initial shock of radiation, the Chernobyl exclusion zone is flourishing. It's now the third largest nature reserve in Europe, and there are lynx, bison, wolves returning, basically because there are fewer humans that they can flourish. And the real tragedy of Chernobyl, I think the most devastating effects, again, came from the fear and stigma of the accident. So you see this huge uptick in alcoholism and suicide from people who are living in the exclusion zone and first responders. You see a huge uptick in elective abortions across Europe because of fear of radiation. And I mean, that's horrible. Not judging them up, just that fear drove so many medically unnecessary abortions. I mean, contrary to the belief that Chernobyl made any part of the exclusion zone uninhabitable, people went back to the other 3 reactors the very next year. And that plant continued to operate through the year 2000.
Wow. I didn't know that.
1987, 1988, and 1989 all had more output than the previous years. The plant got better at performing.
This is blowing
the
my
gulf
mind.
of what people know about, the gulf of what I know about Chernobyl and what
and people so basically then the EU is like, hey guys, this plant sucks and, blew up. If you want to join the EU, you've got to decommission this. And they paid off the government. So the EU paid Ukraine a lot of money to shut down Chernobyl, despite the protests of the people who are living there, because that was their job, their livelihood. And then Ukraine turned around and used that money to start building new nuclear plants.
And they're not even part of the European Union.
Right.
Still not.
They tricked them.
So, So I just think, again, the real cost when it comes to the accidents is the cost that comes from the fear, not from the physical accident themselves.
Yeah. And so I didn't watch the Chernobyl show, but I watched the show Dark. You ever heard of that?
Yeah.
I never finished it, so I'm going to keep this section short.
It's German, right?
It's German. It's in German, and it's kind of terse show, I'd say. There's a lot of time travel. But yeah, they definitely use nuclear power as this plot device, this kind of evil lingering thing in the background. But it does depict this company town all built around a nuclear site that is getting decommissioned after 30, 40 years. And it's been this looming date that's always coming up. And I guess this is coming from truth, because Germany is decommissioning nuclear plants across the country.
Yeah. You would be scarce to find a more anti-nuclear group of people than the Germans. They truly feel it deep in their souls.
They love to overcorrect, I guess.
Yeah. No, that's exactly it.
It's the classic thing about the Germans and hate speech. They're the most Nazi-like about hate speech, that they lock you up instantly if you do it. It's I feel like you guys didn't learn the lesson here. So that show, I don't know. I'm realizing that's where I get my image of nuclear waste too, as well. Because there's literally a scene where a character is walking in a dark cave with a flashlight, and they shine their light up, and there's a stack 8 barrels tall of yellow containers that say with the nuclear symbol on it. And
which is an oil drum often, where I'm like, wait, how did it get associated with like oil drums? That's just kind of a funny little.
I feel like it could just be like from play sets, because I feel like I definitely had play sets where it was like a superhero like throwing like a toxic waste barrel.
A barrel. The barrel. There's something about the image of the barrel calls to us.
I'm just like fascinated by our unknown knowns. Like we don't know how, like we don't know why the slime was so pervasive in our culture.
Concrete.
We don't know how we found out, like we don't know how we got to think about all of these things with respect to the environment, but somehow they're there. Like it's just very interesting trying to pick that apart.
Yeah. And then to get into sort of like nuclear energy in the real world, I wanted to start by just like talking about Germany a bit more. So Germany, they have like a Green Party, and they've really like pushed the other political parties into adopting anti-nuclear stances. And now, for listeners who don't know, Germany doesn't have a single operating nuclear power plant. But the German Green Party is not that different from Green Parties across the globe, which is something I learned this week. I mean, even the American Green Party, like Jill Stein, who previously ran in 2016 and is now running in 2024, she's explicitly said that as part of her platform, she wants to decommission all nuclear power plants. And so I just want to get into like, why is it considered environmental to be like anti-nuclear? And we'll get into the origin of that.
It's so complicated. There's so many factors, but basically I think it gets back to before the idea of climate change, we were pursuing renewable energy not to reduce carbon emissions, but to reduce consumption, to reduce society.
Yeah.
So the reason nuclear isn't a solution is because we don't have to give anything up. Nothing needs to change. Society doesn't need to reorder itself. It allows us to continue to live the way we are living, but just more cleanly. Yeah. And so if you think that industry and development and capitalism are the root of all evil, then nuclear energy is probably your best target because it enables all of those things. In the 60s, Paul Ehrlich, he was a conservationist, and he was saying nuclear power, limitless power through nuclear, is basically the equivalent of giving an idiot child a machine gun because of what we could do with it. So I don't know that Jill Stein is thinking, wow, we need to decommission these power plants across the US because we need to dismantle capitalism and go back to subsistence farming. But I think it's just so deeply ingrained in that movement, in the left wing in particular, that it just becomes canon. It's just the default position.
This desire to like self-flagellate. I don't know where it comes from. Just like, we've been bad humans. We need to return to the state of nature. Like, where is this coming from?
Yeah.
I don't know. I think the Industrial Revolution was a good thing.
Right.
I think it should keep going.
That's a hot take.
Yeah. It was bad in the beginning with all the like kids and factories and stuff. But I think we've gotten better and better at that. Yeah.
But my friend Emmett Penny wrote a really great piece, I think, for American Mind called How Nature Became the Environment. And his thesis is that early on we had this idea that man was sort of separate from nature and had dominion over it. And it was our destiny to both conquer it, but also, to be a responsible steward of it. And as the world progressed, and as we became more secular and lost some of those traditional religious views, you have this void left that you don't know there's no ethical framework for what's our purpose? How do we relate to the environment? Yeah. And so environmentalism attempts to fill that void. So it says actually humans we don't have this God-given dominion. We're merely part of the natural environment. And the more we progress, the less we are in harmony with nature. And you get this I think the crisis and why humans are bad is because there needs to be some crisis to perpetuate the movement, where it's always something, right? It's the ozone layer, it's the pollution in the river, it's climate change. It's trying to replace the ethos of how to live a good life that religion gave us with something different, which is, okay, our goal is survival. And we're always fighting the end of the world. And so I know that's very philosophical, but I really do think, especially on the left, which typically is more secular and has lost sort of those traditional values, that this provides an ethical framework and a sense of purpose, because I do think people need a sense of purpose. They need to feel like they're contributing to something greater than themselves. And what greater purpose than serving Gaia or, you know?
Yeah, I was going to bring up Gaia right next, of like on the most woo-woo, like spiritual sides of the left, like Gaia does always come up. And then we like, and those people always like, oh, I'm not religious in any way. But thank you, Gaia, for this bountiful feast of vegan food we have before us.
Right, but nature is sacred. And this idea that man exists now outside of the environment, that I just find that so interesting too, that anything associated with humans and development is considered unnatural, where I just wonder, and I know it's not this deep, but when you really explain it, it's like, were we better to the environment when we were chopping
burning
down trees for biomass and, you know, and subsistence farming, and everyone was their own farmer? We've actually become much better stewards of the environment as we've developed. And I think people don't realize that, because part of the incentive of environmentalism is there has to be a crisis. Yeah. The story that we're constantly getting better and we're not perfect, but incremental progress is a good thing, is not going to fill that same need.
People don't like when you tell people stuff like America has more trees than it did 50 years ago, right? And then America has more white-tailed deer than it had 70 years ago. And when I visit upstate New York to see my grandparents, it's just these beautiful forests that to my eyes look untouched. But really, these are just the trees that grew back in the 100, 150 years since we chopped them down last. Yeah. Right. Like, you know, it's, I don't know, we want this untouched thing. I don't know.
Yeah, there's a good book I recommend called The New Wild, which is on like invasive species. And it's actually like a very, I mean, genuinely radical idea, but basically like it's on how invasive species actually seem to fill the gaps that we've created as people and the environment. Because there are all these ecological niches that don't exist. And if you actually like study what's going on in these biomes, like it doesn't detract from the diversity to have like an extra invasive species that's then filling this niche and contributing to the food web. But yeah, he has this idea too of like, there are these chapters in the book where he talks about how like a lot of endangered species do well in they do very well in like previously developed or like areas that had like resources extracted. Like nature works in surprising ways and interacts with the human environment. But to circle back, it's really interesting that you said like part of what might be going on with why the left is anti-nuclear is just like this aversion to capitalism. I would not have expected that, just because I know that there were a lot of nuclear reactors built like in the USSR. Right. Yeah.
No, it's true. In fact, the most successful nuclear programs have been in places like France, South Korea, like been state-run enterprises. But also the US had one of the most successful build outs, and we did it through private. It works in so many ways, but it is funny the number of people who I've encountered. Let me say it this way. They'll start off, what about the waste? And I answer that. Well, what about Fukushima? What about Chernobyl? And you sort of answer all of those. And then you get to the bottom and they say, well, it doesn't require reorganizing of society, or it won't dismantle capitalism, so it's not good. And again, you realize they're not looking for the solution. They're not looking for the thing that can substitute for fossil fuels. They're looking for the revolution. And yeah, it's a thing that I've heard from a lot of young people. And again, I'm just, I don't know, maybe I'm boring and just
not radical
overly
enough.
pragmatic.
You don't
and
want a reordering
nuanced.
of society.
But I'm like, yeah, that sounds like it's, it's one of those things that, and I feel like I overly beat up on the left sometimes, but it's only because I consider myself on the left. So it's like,
you're hardest on your own.
You're hardest on your own. But
because the campaign for the green nuclear deal is,
you're using the language of the New Deal.
It's an appeal to a very state involved FDR style build out of nuclear. But I hear like, oh, well, we just need to dismantle this first. And it's a lot of dismantling without willing to put anything else in its place. Or just the idea that you can't achieve progress through incrementalism, through incremental change. And it's just frustrating because, again, even if you think that's a good idea, which I do not think that's a good idea, how are you supposed to build political consensus around that? Like, actually, we need to overthrow the entire system that made us wealthy and that gives us the things people enjoy, to sacrifice for some greater good that feels so intangible that you're not doing a really good job of articulating.
I feel I'm not much of a revolutionary.
I
don't have the makings of a revolutionary.
Which is funny because I feel like sometimes the critique I get from young people is like, oh, your shit is like weak tea. I'm like, if we were able
I think
to
young people are saying that,
the vision that I am, like, if we could build out, I forget what I said. I think I said 50% of our power from nuclear energy by 2050 was my goal. Like, that would be insane. That is not a weak tea vision. That would be,
sounds pretty revolutionary to me.
It's so just radical, but I guess not compared to the overthrow of the regime.
Order,
world order.
But I recommend listeners check out your website because that's where you mention getting to 50%. And you do tie in all of these other like left-wing ideas into your idea of what like a nuclear renaissance revolution would look like including the importance, as you mentioned in the beginning, of like creating a lot of like good jobs. And you've said in other interviews about how like you envision like small scale nuclear reactors being opened in previous coal plants.
Yes. And funny enough, getting back to our people don't fully understand radiation, or one of the impediments to replacing coal plants with smaller nuclear reactors is that by virtue of building on a site where a coal plant has operated and there exists coal ash, it is already too radioactive for the Nuclear Regulatory Commission standards for a nuclear plant operation.
Yeah, I want people to know more about that, like just how radioactive coal burning is.
Yeah, I mean, depending on the type, it can be like, I'm going to double check this after the episode, but like an order of magnitude, if not two more, the standard operations of a coal plant compared to a nuclear plant. So then the question is, okay, do we change regulation? It's just nuclear regulation. It's held to a different standard than any other industry. Yeah. And some nuclear advocates, I understand, are extremely frustrated by that and don't like it. I personally
like the high standards.
I love high standards. I love excellence. Nuclear is an excellent technology, and people can go to work every day feeling safe, not worrying about
There's a value
contamination.
On that,
There's absolutely value to that. I think if it becomes a question of, does it make nuclear prohibitively expensive? That's a different conversation. But I think regulation is something a lot of nuclear advocates use as a scapegoat for why nuclear
hasn't taken off.
And I don't think that's true. But yeah, I mean, coal is extremely dirty for a lot of reasons, but it's not radioactive enough to affect your health. But it's certainly more radioactive than a nuclear plant. So if the goal is radiation, then you would be far more up in arms from the coal replacing the nuclear plants in Germany rather than cheering their shutdown.
Yeah. Do you ever get, I'm not on Twitter now. I was never that active on Twitter. But do you ever get into like Twitter beefs with German Green Party people or anything?
There was...
You gotta watch out. They often speak English.
From like 2017 to 2020, I was pretty involved in international nuclear. And whenever we would go to Germany, we actually held the Nuclear Pride Fest was this idea that advocates from all across Europe would meet in Munich and throw this like big pro-nuclear party to show like, no, we want nuclear and we're proud. And yeah, I mean, it was just, it was rough. Like I just find and I love the German people. If we can categorize it, if we can lump people together, I genuinely get along with many Germans that I know and care for. Their nuclear stuff is just bonkers. And everyone's got their weird hangups. I think
every country has its like, it's our one thing. Don't talk about it. We're not going to fix it. Like, that might be Germany.
But people love to respond to any thread that's just like, you're responsible for killing babies and then
the good discussion is out the window once people accuse you of that.
Like,
nothing good can be had after that.
Yeah. I mean, I think like Germany is our like fifth most common country listening to us. I think like 2 or 3% of our listeners are from there.
I love the Germans. I lived there for 3 years as a kiddo. Like I think they have a great society.
Unparalleled.
Yeah.
However,
yeah.
And now I think Germany is not unlike most countries in the West where there are very loud vocal minorities that are sort of driving the agenda and driving a lot of political positions. Because as soon as the energy crisis hit and they were faced with, no more gas from Russia, polls show that Germans are overwhelmingly, maybe not overwhelmingly, it's more than half, are now in favor of recommissioning and turning back on their nuclear power plants. And it jumped up pretty quickly. So I think anti-nuclearism to a large extent is a luxury belief.
Yeah, I was going to say, it's like, when it gets to brass tacks, we'll see how people hold close to these like fun to have ideas.
Right. Yeah. It's like all fun and games to talk about like the Rube Goldberg machine that you can make to keep the lights on with only wind
together
and solar. But
wind and solar.
But when you're living in Vermont and it's cloudy, you're going to turn on your diesel backup generator. That's how humans are. I mean, it's a rare person that is so deeply committed that they just freeze.
I know I'm thinking of this, but the Zac Efron somehow got like a Netflix deal to have like a show where he'd go around to different things. And he goes to Iceland and he sees their geothermal plant. And he's like, wow, we should be doing this in America. Yeah. It's like, man, we're not on a volcano. We can't do this.
It's different.
I think that's what like anti-nuclear stuff is. It's just like, wow, we should be doing this. Like just looking at solar panels and wind turbines. And it's like, it's not. Come on, man.
We have been doing it for like 20 years and invested billions and billions of dollars and continue to subsidize a technology that's been pretty popular for the past 20 years. And it's not really taken off in the way that most people think it should.
And then I want to get into something a bit more positive, hopefully, but I wanted to ask you about like, Germany's decommissioned all their nuclear power and there are some countries that are adding new ones. We just opened up 2 reactors in Georgia, Vogtle 3 and 4, the later having started commercial operation on April 29th of this year, which is really cool. But I wanted to ask you about like, what project are you most optimistic will start construction again in the US? But before that, I wanted to ask you as part of a second question. So I did see in the news this week that like the Palisades nuclear generating station in Michigan, which is currently decommissioned, it may reopen and start operations again. But for that and Germany, so for like this plant and the plants in Germany, so if they've decommissioned and they're just sort of waiting to be put back online, do you think that cuts into like their lifetime viability, or do you think like them not being in use, like corrosion and things isn't really a factor?
So it depends. For example, Palisades was shuttered less than 2 years ago, and it wasn't fully decommissioned. It was just shut off. It was disconnected from the grid. Yeah. So it was purchased by Holtec, which is a decommissioning company, but they have not done decommissioning work on it yet, which is why it would be relatively straightforward to turn it back on. Unprecedented. Yeah. Huge hugely exciting news, but still from a technical perspective would not be very difficult. In Germany, some of their plants, they were just like, we want these gone. And they have already started work that will at least make it a question. Do we refurbish? Do we undo some of the decommissioning work? It's not simply as easy as turning them back on. I think the last one is still, I'll have to check, but some of them are absolutely capable of turning back on with not the full work of reconstruction. And a lot of that is because it's not like this in all places, but for example, in the Philippines, a nuclear power plant was built under Marcos, and then Marcos left power, and this nuclear plant kind of became associated with corruption and his regime. And so they have a pretty much completely built nuclear plant. I went and toured it. Like the turbines are in there, their Westinghouse design, and they pay, money every year to maintain it, but they just will never turn it on. And so South Korea just put in a bid. They asked, how much would this cost? And I think it was $1 billion, which at that point you're kind of like, do you just build a new plant? But fortunately, there in terms of Palisades, there's not much work that has to be done. And we're finding out day by day, year by year, that these types of reactors that we've built in the US specifically, and that did largely get adopted across the globe, these light water reactors are functionally immortal. That if you just do part replacement and proper maintenance, that they will go far beyond the 40, 60, 80 years we've licensed them. They're looking at beyond 120 now. The only ones that really have to die,
years?
120 years. And, perhaps we'll see when we hit that.
You're brushing up against just the limits of reinforced concrete at that point. Yeah.
Unfortunately, the UK's reactors mostly do have to die. While the rest of the world did light water reactors, they chose a gas-cooled reactor that you basically can't refurbish and maintain unless you break the reactor vessel to get into it. And so
they just bet on the wrong horse.
And now they're actually building like the European equivalent of the AP1000, which is called the EPR, and it's a large light water reactor. So they've course corrected. Nice. They'll be good.
A little bit of a tangent that really is going back into the cultural section, but have you ever seen Pacific Rim?
No, I know of it, but I haven't seen it.
It's so ridiculous. It's such a campy movie, but it's about like
monsters and mechs.
It's about like mechas, like, humans inside of robotic suits fighting kaijus, like monsters from the deep, similar to Godzilla. But anyways, they're all fueled by like nuclear reactors inside of the robots, but they have names like that. They're definitely basing their like naming system off of nuclear plants.
Yeah. I mean, I get that they're like supposed to be monsters, but if I can, again, paint a rosier picture, it's like we powered nuclear submarines with small nuclear reactors. There are using big reactors to produce electricity is just a very small fraction of what nuclear technology can enable. Even from an energy perspective, using heat directly to do high temperature industrial steel making, to do district heating. They're looking at using small reactors to decarbonize international shipping and cargo shipping, which is, bunker oil and that fuel is so dirty.
I guess if aircraft carriers are already powered by nuclear power plants, then why can't we do shipping vessels like that too? These are all good things. There were some zany programs I know in Operation Plowshare, which was the U.S. government thing. I like the naming of it. I always like the kind of biblical poetic naming of it. It's from the "Thou shalt like turn your swords into plowshares, and your spears into pruning hooks."
That was Eisenhower's Atoms for Peace speech at the UN. He got like a 10-minute standing ovation, basically articulating the peaceful uses for nuclear.
But some of the ideas were like to dig out a shipping harbor in Alaska using nuclear bombs. That's just that's just a tool looking for a use.
In Idaho, we drove past basically a parking lot that had these attempted airplane engines, like nuclear reactor airplane engines. I was like, nuclear's not for everything.
No,
Probably
yeah, it's
not.
good when you have a constant cooling when you're in the water, when you're in the ocean. Yeah,
Probably okay not to be air. Maybe in 1,000 years, who can say?
Yeah.
But
when all you have is hammers, all your problems look like nails.
Yeah. I always thought that nuclear submarines meant they had like nuclear missiles on the submarine. Never knew before today that actually meant that they had it for energy.
Yeah, so they just don't have to resurface or refuel for many years.
It's the human food is the biggest limit. Yeah.
Yeah. But yeah, to circle back, okay, so the Palisades nuclear plant may reopen, but you would know more than anyone. So like what else do you feel like might open that you're like optimistic about in the near future? I mean, it's not going to be that near because it takes a long time to build these things, but
again, this is where the pro-nuclear community doesn't always. I feel like I am an optimist, but I am a pragmatic optimist. And so a bunch of the hype in the pro-nuclear circles and on Reddit is like advanced nuclear. And for a lot of people, that means small modular reactors. It means using different types of fuel, like sodium fast reactors. And I mean, these things are all physically possible, but I think it's this wishful thinking where it's like, okay, everyone already hates the stuff we have. So let's just like repackage it and give them this new good nuclear that
clean
will
coal,
have none of
cool new nuclear.
Right. It's like this will have none of the
grandpa's
problems
nuclear reactor
of existing nuclear because it's going to be cheaper and it's going to be easier to build and it's going to be able to be built on time and on budget. And it's going to be better and safer. And it's all of those things because it does not exist yet. So it can be whatever it wants to be. But I don't see us leapfrogging from a state of managed decline where we've been shutting existing reactors down and
into
not
a renaissance.
building for decades into like a renaissance of flourishing novel reactor types. I think new technologies and new builds come out of experience. They come out of veteran builders, established supply chains.
Boring stuff.
Yeah.
Good, boring stuff.
Good, boring stuff.
Yeah.
So I think if there was going to be a project that I would put my money on, it would be Vogel 5, where it's another AP1000 at a place that has a workforce that has done the hard work of reestablishing the supply chains, training people. I think part of like an interesting policy problem for new nuclear builds in the US is that half of the country is in what's called are in RTOs, which are basically competitive energy markets. So instead of the traditional, there is one large vertically integrated utility that has a monopoly and they
state regulated.
State regulated, which is what Vogel in Georgia is. Southern is the utility. Instead, it's been broken up where you can have generation separate from transmission, which is separate. They basically split up all of the vertically integrated parts of the utility. And now it prioritizes, okay, what's cheapest? What can bid into the market is cheap. And so that was what was the issue in Illinois is that we are in this market where we were competing, the nuclear plants were competing against historically cheap natural gas and heavily subsidized renewables. And so even if renewables weren't subsidized, even if gas is not historically cheap, it's really hard to justify a large nuclear build, even any sort of nuclear build, because it's something you do because of long-term planning. They will pay themselves off. I think almost every nuclear plant, aside from one that was finished in the early 2000s, has paid itself off multiple times over. But that's because we have long-term time horizons. And so it makes sense in a utility where they can say, hey, we're going to need this. We have these projections. We're going to need this power. We'll spread it over the course of, or we'll spread it out over the entire rate base or customer base over this many years. We don't have that. This is like short-term market efficiencies.
Nearsighted, like, all right, can this be done by the next election? Like, kind of like, I think political
It's just what's cheapest. It doesn't matter what's more reliable, what's more resilient. It's just what at any given moment, what is the cheapest power on the grid? And so, yeah, I struggle to see how nuclear gets built in a place like that. I struggle to see how a lot of these advanced reactor companies, I wish that I were as confident about nuclear as some of these nuclear startup founders who are like, actually, it's super easy. And it's like, oh, really?
Like Silicon Valley, like brain virus
if only
infecting
someone
another
had
field.
ever done it the way that I envisioned doing it, and then it would be fine. And
I'm
then,
a plucky outsider, kind of a Steve Jobs type.
Right.
Like,
and then it sucks because they make all of these promises and then inevitably collapse. We've seen it a couple of times. I don't want to overly beat a dying horse, but I think a big nuclear startup or advanced nuclear company is probably going to go out of business by the end of the year. One that has MOUs all over the country that promise to build, and that's horrible for nuclear because it just, again, looks like nuclear's over-promising and under-delivering when it's just going to have to be boring, and it's going to have to be big, and it's going to be over budget, and it's going to be behind schedule because welcome to infrastructure in America. But we're going to have to...
Not always glamorous.
Right, it's not glamorous, but if we're going to have any hope of delivering projects, whether it be light or like heavy rail, light rail, any sort of mass public transit, the housing required to meet scarcity in cities, like we just need to build.
Yeah, this is making me think of how like Elon Musk is anti-high-speed rail, but he's pro-hyperloop. Even though like public transit people will look at the idea of a hyperloop and be like, okay, it's basically high-speed rail, but in a tube, which is more infrastructure, which why would that cost less? And it's just like this new technology when there's an existing one that like works pretty well.
Yeah, and it's sacrificing the perfect or sacrificing the good for the perfect. Actually, there's this better thing that exists and we don't want to have to deal with the annoying headaches of the real world. So we're just going to hold out until we can deliver on
that. And nothing is ever good enough. Like, no, we're waiting for perfect nuclear. We can't do.
Right. And that's why, like, I think we're about to get into this with some of the politics in Illinois, but anti-nuclear people love advanced nuclear. I've said for a long time now that I am for advanced nuclear. That's like a big red flag for anti-nuclear because of course you love the thing that doesn't exist. And what you call advanced nuclear that gets built in the real world is nuclear. So as soon as that starts to become a reality, they're going to turn on that project too. It's sort of, I think a lot of nuclear people see it as this bridge or this compromise. Like, okay, we'll get nuclear as long as it's like Cinderella going to the ball. Like once she does the dishes and mops and then we can have it. And the stepmother promised. No, but she set up the game so that you would always lose.
Jump through all these hoops.
That idea of, being pro advanced nuclear, but not like really supporting the existing technology and not wanting to build it more. I wanted to talk about Illinois a bit. We're a Chicago-based podcast. And so our governor is J.B. Pritzker, who may end up running for president. I've been hearing rumors as someone who works in city government. So that is on the horizon, I think. But
I vote for him.
He, we as a state, we have 6 nuclear reactors, which I think has been mentioned already, which is pretty high. It's like we get 50% of our energy from nuclear. I think the only state that gets more of its energy from nuclear is South Carolina, right? So yeah, we should be proud of it. I mean, we're the prairie state, but in some ways we also feel like we're the nuclear state. And so he prevented the shutdown of 2 nuclear plants, like you mentioned earlier, but he did veto legislation recently that would have lifted the ban on nuclear energy plants because he said it was like, I feel like this is going to turn into like big boondoggles where, I want small scale nuclear reactors, not big ones, because then it's going to, we're going to need to publicly fund it and something. You know more about this than me for sure. But what do you think we can do about him?
I mean, look, as you said, he knows the value of big nuclear because he stepped in and signed legislation to save those 2 nuclear plants back in 2021. And he's not a dumb guy. So the only way to read this is like, I think it's just a pretty bad political miscalculation.
Yeah.
So charitably to him, I think it's very hard in Chicago and Illinois to do anything that looks somewhat good for Exelon or ComEd.
Yeah, they're kind of a no-no.
They're persona non grata.
They're constantly getting into scandals to people who don't know. Yeah, there's lots of political horse trading and investigations and...
Totally. And on top of all of that, they're a big utility. So you're in the pocket of big business and, they're so corrupt. Like, we are all in living memory. I think it might even still be in litigation of the recent corruption scandal. Yeah. So when he says no new big nuclear, he doesn't want that. I mean, that's pretty much, I don't want Exelon to be building another nuclear plant. Now, again, Exelon would not build another could not in any way that I could see build a nuclear plant like an AP1000 here, because we are in an RTO. But I also think it's that appeal to the left, the progressive wing of his party, and to the large environmental groups, which have a lot of sway in Illinois. You know, working on legislation and just hearing how important these environmental scorecards are to politicians. They have a lot of sway and they are deeply anti-nuclear. And so saying, nothing that exists, only the stuff that doesn't exist yet, is a really easy way of saying, look, I'm not anti-nuclear. I just think it needs to be this specific kind.
The fantasy nuclear reactor. Yeah.
Exactly. So he thought he could have it both ways. And I think if he does run for president, this will definitely be something he is asked about, because you're also seeing Democratic governors like in Michigan or Gavin Newsom in California stepping in to save Diablo Canyon. I mean, he previously was the one to negotiate the deal to kill Diablo Canyon.
But then again, luxury political opinions.
Right, exactly. It was like, actually, it would be really bad for my political career if we had more blackouts. So, I think it was a bad move. I think Illinois will have to, the idea too is so absurd that if we just removed the ban, there was no other political action that was going to be taken. It's simply not illegal anymore. It didn't promise money. It didn't say that we were going to look into it, start a committee. It was just, it could exist. That would not have led to a single project. So all this did was to muck up the works and make it difficult to build something that, again, I don't think it would have gotten built, but exists in the real world that is actually providing clean energy today. And it's called the AP1000, before it existed in Georgia, was an advanced reactor design.
Yeah.
But now that it exists, it's existing nuclear. It's not good anymore and it's not advanced. So I don't know what can be done about him.
Such an impossible treadmill.
Yeah.
If you build it, you have committed the sin. You are now a regular nuclear reactor.
Yeah. I mean, if he becomes, we need to get him on board with nuclear if he becomes president. But we could get a new governor maybe eventually that figures out a way to do something about this. But I mean, as not an elected official, I mean, talking broadly, what do you think that everyday people can do to try to get more nuclear reactors built?
I mean, I think one of the big problems for nuclear is that politicians, it's just so deeply ingrained that nuclear is bad and that people hate nuclear, that even in the presence of new polling that suggests that nuclear is actually popular, it's still hard to get them to take action. So just being pro-nuclear and asking for nuclear and saying that you would be happy with nuclear in your backyard is a huge first step. Being vocal about pro-nuclearism. Beyond that, it's hard to say. I mean, right now, the Biden administration has completely pivoted to being pretty pro-nuclear. I mean, the idea that Palisades could come back from the dead, so to speak, is a huge, I mean, I just can't believe how quickly the tide has changed from even 2 or 3 years ago.
Yeah.
But now we're just up against a lot of policy problems. You know, how do we build in big infrastructure and RTOs? How do we train a workforce? If we are going to do a large nuclear build out, how would we have the talent to do so? How does our nuclear regulation need to change to make it more efficient? Is regulation even a problem? We're currently we're operating under the Nuclear Waste Policy Act, which says we're going to build a site at Yucca Mountain, and Yucca is dead. Like, Yucca is politically dead.
I was going to say Nevada's own perennial issue, the Yucca Mountain site, which I can remember from even elementary school. They told us it was this evil thing they were planning. Yeah.
Yeah.
Because he grew up in Las Vegas.
Yeah. So
I'm with the anti-nuclear people on Yucca Mountain. I don't think it should be built, but that's because I think the waste is completely fine where it is. Mm-hmm. So it's like you're not.
Don't need to squirrel it away.
Right. It's just like spending billions of dollars for no good reason. Why? If you're going to bury it underground, you don't bury benign things underground.
Yeah.
You know, so it's just perpetuating the idea that nuclear waste is uniquely hazardous compared to any of the other industrial waste that we produce, when that's not the case.
Yeah.
And so it's like spending billions of dollars on extremely bad PR for no health benefit, no safety benefit, no environmental benefit. But then, okay, if we're like, yeah, we don't need Yucca, then we should pass legislation saying, how should we have the industry be funding waste management that doesn't look like a final repository? So right now, I think it's all about vibes. I know it's like, it's just like being pro-nuclear. And then I think sort of getting into, I think we are all kind of nerdy and very into housing and public transit and big infrastructure, the YIMBY movement for sure. So I think we need to tie a bunch of those things together into a vision that fills that void that we still have. Like, I think environmentalism has done it in a really dark way.
Yeah, and we need like a bountiful vision.
Yes, we need like what does human and environmental prosperity look like? Why is this a project worth pursuing? Like, we obviously know that nuclear is superior across a lot of different metrics for energy generation, reliability, resiliency, land use. Yeah. But we also know, or at least advocates know, that the information deficit model, the idea that, if people are just presented with the facts on nuclear, they'll change their mind, is not the case. It just doesn't offer the explanatory power. In fact, a lot of people who are anti-nuclear know more about nuclear than the average person. So if it's not just a lack of information, it is a lack of vision. It's a lack of meaning. And I think this technology, which enables all of those other things, is ripe for a new story.
Yeah.
And so that's something that I think tying these movements together and creating the idea that, no, it's not about survival. It's about living well.
It's about thriving.
Yeah, it's about thriving. What does it mean to live a good life? And how is that related to physical infrastructure?
Yeah. I think it's a conversation that people are like ready for. I don't know. It's a little nuts and bolts, but it is also idealistic. I think people want that. Like, it's local. It's something that can happen around you. For nuclear, yes, more on the state level, I will say. It's not going to be down the block from you, like supporting a small coffee shop in the more YIMBY movement. But I think I really trust people. I've seen like just a change I've seen in people from like, I think the standard line 5 years ago was, there's a new apartment building, those evil developers bringing gentrifiers, where now I feel like the average lefty person is like, that's more housing for local families.
I still encounter like DSA people who are just very anti-condos, but I think I once read this think piece where someone was saying that like housing shows that the left is able to look at data and reanalyze long-held opinions, and hopefully nuclear energy is another place that they can do that.
Yeah, and I think, like you said, it's already starting. And something that gives me a lot of hope is that people who I encounter either in my work locally with housing and public transit or, in the nuclear space, a common thread is just a deep love for humanity.
Yeah.
And it's
human positivism and humanist.
That humans are actually good and the things that we do are good. And it, it's not everything we do is perfect, but we are constantly getting better. And I think that's a really optimistic, if someone is pro-coal, doesn't believe in climate change, trying to think of other things that
gas vehicles,
will never give up their car, but they come to me and say, I have a deep love for humans and I want humans to prosper and I want there to be more of them. I can work with that person. I would rather work with that person than someone who is in my political camp.
But self-flagellating for the sin of being human. Yeah, and
exactly.
for existing and
I can
taking
build
away.
society with one of those. Yeah. The other is much harder to bring on board.
No, that's true.
Yeah. Well, that was a very good, uplifting, philosophical note to probably end on. Thank you so much for coming on.
Yeah, thanks.
Thank you guys for having me. Like I said, I love doing podcasts, but a lot of them are more on, debunk or repeat the talking points. So actually getting into the discourse and the aesthetics is what I really love about it.
I think that I first started seeing I think I would see anti-nuclear people a lot. People would just complain about that. But I think we have to bring it back to being just broadly pro-nuclear. Don't just be negative about the naysayers. Be positive about the technology and the capabilities and how it's going to improve people's lives.
It's easy to be anti things. It's harder to be pro things.
Yeah.
But I'm pro-human, pro-nuclear, and I think other people can get on board with that vision too.
Definitely.
But we'll link, your website to in the show notes. We'll also link your social media because if you want to know what's going on with nuclear, Madi is a good person to follow. But thanks again to everyone for listening this week and have a good one.
See ya.